Cybercrime is no longer the shadowy underworld that it once was. Today, it's a thriving industry, a whole ecosystem of threat actors, malware, and exploits that impact organizations and individuals worldwide. This video is meant to be a sort of documentary. We'll look through some defining moments of the past year in cybercrime to discuss methods, players, and the aftermath. From malware as a service operations to data breaches and the human stories behind them, we'll explore the real-world impacts of cybercrime. And you won't just hear it from me. I wanted to ask other experts who've helped perform takedowns, investigated the culprits, and led organizations through the chaos. First, we dive into the takedown of one of the most pervasive malware threats in recent history, the Redline info stealer.
This is a Redline part. If you take that out, the 1,000 to 1,300 people that were hosting a panel will not be able to log in.
You might be familiar with the story as Operation Magnus. Then we'll discuss the Snowflake data breach, revealing how a coalition of cyber criminals goes even further than just digital threats, but even real physical damage, personal harm, and violence as a service.
In the world of cybercrime, you don't typically see it cross over, the physical world into like actual kinetic attacks. But this is certainly an example where real life violence has bled over into an online community.
Finally, we'll hear from a seasoned CISO, or a Chief Information Security Officer, about the human aspect of defending against data breaches and lessons learned from the trenches.
If you are a very public target and you have multiple in a year, it can be really, really hard on teams.
This is the State of Cybercrime, looking back at 2024. And the conversation of cybercrime cannot be had without the discussion of info stealer malware. Info stealers are one of the most prolific cyber threats, enabling criminals to harvest credentials, financial data, and sensitive information from victims all over the world. One of the most notorious, Redline stealer, has wreaked havoc since its emergence. But let's learn a bit more just how security researchers, and soon after law enforcement, collaborated to disrupt Redline's operations.
It was sold as a malware as a service, so you could use it with little to no technical skills. The stealer malware basically collects all kinds of information on your system, credentials, cryptocurrency wallets, some interesting files, and just collects them, sends them back to the person running the panel. Usually that's sold to someone else. Sometimes they can use it to sell it to initial access brokers or be initial access brokers themselves. The goal is to make money.
This is Alex. He, in combination with the data received from the endpoint security provider ESET, revealed just how widespread Redline had become. He collaborated with another researcher, Matthew.
So at that time that we started the investigation, Redline was competing with two other big malware family, which were Raccoon and Vidar, that was other info malware stealer. When we started to look into Redline, they were really popular at that time. Their campaigns about fake Windows 11 updates was thriving, and they had like a lot of different malware. They were representing at the time that we started, I think, almost half of the info malware stealer sample that we're finding.
But their mission wasn't just to analyze Redline, it was to disrupt it.
Creating fake honeypot computer that we infect in order to track and understand what's the spread and what's the amount of campaigns that we're tracking.
The panel is what people can buy or rent on the dark web, and that's the nice little GUI that allows them to control their campaign, generate malware, and get that information. They have to buy that from someone who has been indicted now by the Department of Justice in the US, somebody in Russia. That person is managing, has what we call it the back end, because it's called the back end server for everything. So to authenticate, panels have to connect to it, and to generate malware samples, it is done on the back end. So it makes it harder to crack the panel, more profitable for the operator. We found some of those samples.
What they had discovered wasn't just any of the usual control panels. They had access to the mothership. They had the core, the centralized backend that all of the Redline stealer panels phoned home to.
You map up to 1,000 IP.
Yeah, just over 1,000
for that. So that's kind of give an idea of like where those 1,000 panels are located and hosted. So that's kind of was also an interesting finding. We found that most of those panels were hosted on hosting provider that were not responding to takedown requests or being really slow to respond to takedown requests for obvious reason. But I think in that part, which was really interesting, is Alex have access to the one instance code that was running, that was a backend. You were also able to recreate a lab environment of that. So you could like have the full interaction between the three modules of Redline in lab to kind of study the different communication and the different process.
So they could fight back. They could understand the inner workings of the source code, implementation and processes, and potentially find a weak link in the chain. One of their key discoveries was what they called a dead drop resolver mechanism.
For the affiliates, when they were hosting the panel, what happened is the panel will actually load parts of files on GitHub that the panel will decrypt. And in that file that the panel decrypt, it does contain 20 IP that are most likely reverse proxy to the one backend. So like those 20 IP that connect to the backend, and each time the panel load, randomly select one of those 20 IP, connect to it, like check the license and communicate with the backend of Redline. And this is how you've been authenticated and be able to log to your panel. This is how you've been able to generate malware, etc. All of this communication between the panel and the backend happen using that initial part of like, what are the 20 IP addresses that are the reverse proxy to the backend, and selecting randomly one of those. Those can change because it's hosted on GitHub, and like you can add and update the files that are being hosted there. So the concept of like downloading a file, decrypting it, finding an IP, and connecting to it, we call it the dead drop resolver mechanism. So we find other files probably from past Redline version. In that file, since it was hosted on GitHub, what we did is actually we were able to navigate to find some contact with GitHub that we were able to say, hey, this is a Redline part. It's an important link in the chain. If you take that out, the 1,000 to 1,300 people that were hosting a panel will not be able to log in. So they won't be able to run the campaign, create additional malware to generate infection. So basically kind of disrupting a little bit the ecosystem of Redline. And what we saw is when we take down the GitHub, there was some as well within Flare, some discussion about like affiliate being a little bit pissed but not being able to log in into the panel, and they had to roll out a new version. So we kind of saw that we have the feedback on this. The other interesting things is after this, they decided that GitHub wasn't secure anymore, and they moved it out to Pastebin. Within Pastebin, we're able to also run a takedown and remove it from Pastebin.
It was super fast with Pastebin.
Back in the day, we had a pro account from Pastebin that was when we started Flare. So we already have like with that account like kind of the advantage of having like prioritized takedowns. So we use that. So I think it took like not even a day. I was out of
something like that.
And then after they started to use infected websites, I think they repurposed expired domains as well.
Yeah, it's not clear in all cases. Either they were legitimate domains that they compromised, or they bought domains that were previously legitimate and used them for this, so that it bypasses them domain reputation checks.
And these disruptions didn't just inconvenience operators. It made a bigger impact to the Redline stealers' standing in the cybercrime industry.
After the takedown, those first disruptions with GitHub and Pastebin, basically the operator had to compile a new version of panel and send it back to all of the affiliates again. Couldn't just tweak something in the backend. So everybody had to re-download the new version. That's a hassle and may have caused some people to switch. And I have to tell you, having people on like malware forums be mad at something you did is a great feeling. Reading all them, these guys, it's fun.
But security is a game of cat and mouse. And in this case, they're going toe-to-toe with threat actors. So Alex and Matteo got to watch just how exactly Redline was going to try and adapt and recover from these disruptions.
At some point, they switched and they said, all right, let's rewrite our thing. So the versions we checked in 2022 and 2023, the network communication used Windows Communication Foundation Framework, which is a kind of SOAP, but not really specific to Microsoft. And so they were using that to communicate between the different components. Sometime this year, they said, it sucks. So they rewrote it to use the REST API. They're going modern. And that REST API, instead of having a dead drop, it was just the panel contained the domain directly and they connected to that to handle the REST API. And those are the two domains that are present, like mentioned in the backend.
Adaptable doesn't mean invincible, though. By targeting infrastructure and creating disruptions, researchers like Alex and Matteo demonstrated the power of persistence in combating cybercrime.
Sadly, informatics theater are still booming. I think it's done for Redline. We don't know if the code was reshared before the indiction and like the takedown by the law enforcement. So we can't say for sure that the code is eradicated and does not exist anymore. So there may be some people with the backend version of it, and hopefully we don't see it, but that's a possibility that we see Redline reborn happening. But on the general sense, I think unfortunately that's also kind of the reality of when you work in malware, is you take one campaign down and you just left an open space for other contender to take the space. And I think this is unfortunately what we saw. And it's still a big problem. So we see more and more serial logs being used.
And their work assisted law enforcement in what became Operation Magnus. They literally played a part in reshaping the cybercrime landscape. They were moving the needle. And it's a pretty great mission and a certain story of success in fighting back against cybercrime. Sometimes, though, cyber criminals do damage with more than just ones and zeros. Some have made waves in a way that hasn't been done before. And there is one case study from this year that really paints the picture. The emergence of a unique group, a collective known as the COM. Their operations have left a trail of high-profile victims. And my friend Nick will help shine light on some of the interesting dynamics of one of the more active cybercriminal subgroups, what's now been called Scattered Spider.
When we're looking at the last year in cybercrime, a definite standout, I'm not sure what to call it, a group, I guess. It's kind of a loose subgroup of a much larger group called the COM. The group known as Scattered Spider had a big year. Not only a big year in victims, which they were able to compromise through a variety of campaigns done by a variety of subgroups within the COM, but also in high-profile arrests.
Scattered Spider operates a little differently from traditional cybercrime groups. It's a loosely knit gang, bound not by hierarchy, but by opportunity.
Sort of where the scattered in the name comes from, we presume, is that this group is not hierarchical. It's not like a traditional ransomware operation where you've got a boss and an HR department and customer service. It's something that looks more akin to an organization or a business than a criminal gang. Scattered Spider is very much small subgroups and friends teaming up on campaigns, using each other's skills sort of when they need them, not in extremely well-planned or large campaigns unfolding over a very large timeline, but rather opportunistically getting each other involved in attacks where they know they can be helpful to one another.
One of Scattered Spider's most public campaigns was the Snowflake breach, an incident that had made news and headlines for days on end.
Some now arrested members of Scattered Spider used info stealer log channels to find active credentials to Snowflake tenants, which did not have two-factor authentication enabled in them. And they stole sensitive data from a wide variety, over 100 Snowflake tenants, to include AT&T, Ticketmaster, Neiman Marcus, Santander Bank, many other financial institutions, telecommunications companies, the list goes on.
Scattered Spider's methods include extortion, demanding payments under the threat of releasing stolen data, like the typical ransomware tactics.
Or if the victim paid the extortion fee, they didn't release the data. So while not a ransomware campaign in the traditional sense, things were definitely held for ransom and the victims were extorted.
And truth be told, there are so many data points now in today's day and age that this is a clear trend. The tactics employed by Scattered Spider and others are now the more modern and effective actions, where it's not about just running malware on the endpoint. The device isn't the target anymore, it's you. They aren't going after the endpoint. There are numerous incidents where there's no malware at all in the final attack chain. The target is your identity.
It's a relatively short jump from committing basic hacks in video games to realizing how easy and trivial it can be to use pre-existing tools to execute actual cyber crimes. So they typically now become relatively novice cyber criminals, boasting very confidently about their exploits to their community, often to people who knew them before they became a cyber criminal. So these might be friends in video game communities that know their identity because they weren't hiding it before. Shortly after their exploits become public, they attract the attention of law enforcement because of them bragging or flashing money online or buying very opulent things at a suspiciously young age. And then law enforcement comes looking, finds some old leak of something like OG users, finds that first personal email address they used to create their first account, follows that username across a couple forums to the place they're at now before they adopted Serious OPSEC. Even if they adopted Serious OPSEC later, they're typically able to put the pieces together by a number of interesting techniques or subpoenas to legitimate platforms they may have been using for attacks. And then boom, they're arrested. I think Joel and Noah are good ones to zoom in on. They were known players of Minecraft hardcore factions. This trail that led from their original doxes many years ago to their online identities now, which are, used in serious cybercrime operations, follow a similar thread. This thread can be found in a myriad of arrests executed by federal law enforcement over probably the last 2 to 4 years would be an accurate time range, where we can follow the typical life cycle of someone getting involved in cybercrime, specifically in the English-speaking cybercrime communities. That follows a relatively consistent pattern of steps. One is an individual, typically a young male between the ages of 14 and maybe 20, gets deeply involved in an online gaming community. This person, once being extremely online in this community, sees people with cool usernames and wants a cool username themselves. It usually is well known in these communities that to get a cool username, you have to steal it. So they learn how to hack their way into or buy with crypto a cool username to use in this game. Maybe it's Minecraft Factions, maybe it's 5M, maybe it's an Instagram or Twitter handle that they want. They use their real name or email address to create their first account on a hacking forum or on OG users or on any number of places where they know they can go to get the job done that they want, which is oftentimes getting a cool username, but is also just as often getting hack tools to take down some rival faction. In the process of trying to get this cool username and using their email to create accounts on these forums to start posting questions or solicitations, they learn the basics of cybercrime by trying to get done what they're trying to get done. They typically stumble upon phishing, SIM swapping, relatively low-level social engineering techniques, and then, sometimes bridging into interesting, more simple recon or DDoS attack types or tools. They learn the basics of cybercrime to steal accounts or take down a rival faction or DDoS somebody or dox somebody. Usually, they realize relatively quickly by becoming involved in the more nefarious part of the community that the exact same skills they used to get done whatever it is their goal was can be applied cross-functionally to a real crime to target someone. Instead of a username, get into someone's account that has money sitting in it, like a crypto account, and drain it.
But at the end of the day, a threat actor's origin story shouldn't matter too much. When they operate and begin to take real action with real impact, they are a criminal and should face the real consequences, including efforts from law enforcement.
Some of the more recent interesting arrests were Alexander Muka or Connor Muka, who went by Waifu, among many other names, was arrested in Canada in association with the Snowflake attacks attributed to, I believe, over 160 individual Snowflake tenants that were compromised with stolen data. The last one, this is someone who's actually been sitting in prison in Turkey for a while, is John Aaron Binns, or Intel Secrets, who was indicted by the US government for their role in a T-Mobile hack from 2021, but was picked up in Turkey, where they'd been living for a little bit, after attempting to buy, I believe, a Stinger missile while living in Turkey, which attracted the attention of the Turkish government.
These arrests highlight the international scope of their operations and the challenges of combating a group as dispersed as the COM.
A lot of people use to connect Scattered Spider to Russian cyber organized crime or ransomware groups was the fact that Scattered Spider allegedly used Black Cat ransomware. They posted it to their data leak site to execute those campaigns. While this means there certainly was an affiliate relationship there, we're not really sure how far that goes. If there are major connections between Scattered Spider and Russian organized crime beyond the affiliate relationship with Black Cat, but certainly an interesting observation that a sort of loosely knit Western cybercrime group, mostly based in the US, Canada, and the UK, is interacting with criminal elements on some of the more storied parts of the world of cybercrime, the ransomware groups that have been around for much longer and traditionally have kind of looked down upon the English-speaking cybercrime communities for their, what they would call immaturity compared to the sort of mature, quieter operations that the Russian gangs typically use.
The COM has been pushing boundaries, though. They aren't just doing damage from a computer keyboard, they're crossing into real-world violence.
Another important note, and this was outlined in great detail by Brian Krebs, is the relationship between Scattered Spider and violence as a service offerings. Overwhelmingly in use against each other, SIM swappers who existed in these communities, the Scattered Spider and the COM communities, have been known to, and many of the videos have made their way, publicly onto the internet, have been known to engage in violence as a service against each other. Again, some of the perpetrators who were paid to execute these attacks sit in jail. So law enforcement definitely watches these things closely, but they would pay each other to shoot, into each other's homes, throw bricks through each other's windows, kidnap members and send videos to other members to extort them for stolen cryptocurrency. And it's one of the more, in the world of cybercrime, you don't typically see it cross over, the physical world into like actual kinetic attacks outside of nation state activities. But this is certainly an example where real life violence has bled over into an online community, specifically the COM.
Scattered Spider is a stark symbol of just how cybercrime has evolved. But there's room for mistakes, and there are opportunities to really combat against cybercrime. Take Connor Muka as a fine example, and the others still waiting for their turn in prison.
Their path to cybercrime was relatively quick. The life cycle of specifically these members of the COM who have been arrested was relatively small, anywhere between 2 and 4 years, from being involved in video games in some, very, very niche online serious gaming community to eventually ending up behind bars.
The thing is, though, we live through the effects. Incidents and data breaches and whatever supply chain downstream effects might impact the everyday individual, but for security practitioners, we're the ones that live and breathe it every day. And it takes a certain amount of fortitude to do that, especially when you're the person in charge. When you are the one that has to take responsibility for whatever data breach or incident, there's much more of a human aspect that doesn't often get to be seen. But that is super important. What is the real feeling when you're in the hot seat? When it all falls to you as, say, CISO or Chief Information Security Officer, how do you live through a ransomware incident, or a data breach, or any other cybercrime effects? Behind every security incident is someone who might be a scapegoat second, but a leader first. They are the ones steering the organization through the chaos. So I wanted to get those real, raw tales from the trenches, and I asked Jason Haddix, who has weathered the storm more than once.
I think there are, levels of cybersecurity incidents and breaches, right? Minor things which are classified as incidents, which, don't really constitute raising the alarm bells, but then you have real breaches that are corporate level or data breach level that is all hands on deck. You'll have security leaders who have had that experience. It is traumatizing. Being in that seat, especially at a big organization, is a special skill set to drive that ship while it's going.
Jason talked to me about the certain kind of pressure that security leaders face during breaches, from operational challenges to emotional hardships.
It's also just a high stress environment. I've had staff quit in the middle of a breach before, unfortunately, because it was so stressful. No one ever talks about, like the burnout impact if you have 2 or 3 breaches in the year, right? Like one breach most teams can handle. If you are a very public target and you have multiple in a year, it can be really, really hard on teams.
Beyond managing the technical response, you have to navigate organizational communication.
Out-of-band communications is really important because even if one system's compromised and it's not the same system you're using for chat, you don't know if the chat system or the communication system like email will be subject to attacker access. I mean, we ended up using Signal at a lot of places. So we would create a Signal group for the incident commanders, and we would practice in our tabletops every year. Okay, so our communication systems is compromised. Let's try to do the whole tabletop through Signal, at least the beginning of it, until we feel good about eradication, and then we can move back to our designated chat platform.
And first and foremost, it's clear that radical transparency has to be a cornerstone of breach response. You have to tell everyone what is good, bad, and ugly. That's the only way you can keep a semblance of trust and unity.
We had both executive and technical people meetings with entire tech teams, and we brought them in with our third-party vendor who helped us do the investigation and eradication and all of the analysis. And we presented the whole thing as a team with like open arms and complete transparency. And we did that, and that was the best response to a breach I've ever had at any organization. Everybody was on board. Everybody understood why we were doing what we were doing. It mitigated a lot of discussions around, like having to convince people to do work because everybody felt like they were part of the process to recover.
But what's the real weakness? What is it that keeps falling apart? Is it really something as simple as a password? Or at the very least, anything else that just feels so inconsequential? Turns out it usually is.
It's credential operations, I think. Either initial access is gained by some sort of leaked credential, or pivoting after they get initial access to get to their goal is some sort of leaked credential. That was the common thread among at least my 5 years of security leadership previously. There's always some sort of secret that gets leaked. Sometimes it's on the dark web, but other times they get initial access from another method. Then in order to get to their stated goal, which is usually steal source code, ransomware you, or just shut down your systems, it's like a hard-coded password in Artifactory, or it's like in GitLab or something like that you didn't have configured correctly, and then they steal that, and that has higher elevated permissions so they can pivot. It's the kind of stuff you would see if you were running a tool like Bloodhound pretty regularly. Bloodhound will find Active Directory credentials and Active Directory paths, but it doesn't find those like API keys that also give access to other parts of infrastructure and stuff like that.
So I asked Jason, what is it? What is it that organizations keep getting wrong? Or at least, what's something that can be boarded up and usually isn't?
One of the big parts is credentials and other secrets, right? And so one thing we didn't have at one of my big companies, and I called around to my other CISO friends at that time, nobody else had it really either, was a secrets management program, like a whole part of your security program that's dedicated to handling secrets and secret sprawl or whatever you want to call it, like exposures or whatever. And so there are 3 usual ways you design a security program. It's prevent, detect, and respond, right? And in most cases, in IR, in other types of security programs. And so we went about, on our repos, protecting as much as we can and finding everything that was already out there with certain tools. But then you also need to proactively monitor basically the dark web and the chat channels and all that. And that is a significant undertaking for a threat intel team to do by themselves.
That always strikes me as another sort of harsh reality of security. The best advantage you can have is just knowing your own playing field.
Right. And so, our analysis was that we'd rather outsource that part to a really, really good vendor. And so that's how I, first found out about Flare was they had that capability of exposure management. And it transcended just also the credentials and the API keys and stuff too. On the dark web, it also went past that into GitHub, which were other exposures. We were receiving a lot through our bug bounty. And so it helped us kind of cut costs there a little bit and find all those, and also provided us with a feed that we didn't really have at the time, which was threat intel that was very poignant to our environment. So we would hear about chatter, people talking about hacking our product, and we would be able to proactively kind of see where they were going to hit and stuff like that. So, that's part of this threat intel and a subsection of threat intel secrets management program at any organization. I think that in the next 2-3 years, every company is going to design a secrets management program in their security program.
But the cost after the fact is so much worse than the cost up front. When the damage is done, they say hindsight is 20/20, but the prep work and defenses just so clearly become a necessity.
If you are a very public target and you have multiple in a year, it can be really, really hard on teams to be in a breach cycle, which means extra overtime, means staggered shifts, and hopefully you compensate for all that. Hopefully you get compensated for all that. But sometimes, it is an extraordinary amount of work, and it can happen any time of the year. It could happen during Christmas. It could happen during Thanksgiving or any, holiday. So there's a lot of underserved, under-talked about things about actually dealing with big incidents or big breaches.
So 2025, right? If we're looking at just these 3, albeit 2 cherry-picked stories from this past year, where do we go for the next year and the year after that? Is it always just going to be chasing cybercrime? Will we ever get off the treadmill? I don't know. But the only way we've seen a crumb of progress, the only way we've moved the needle, even if it's back to where it was before threat actors moved it in the first place, it's just from knowing more about the adversaries, knowing more about our own environments, our own assets, our own defenses, and our own identity, our own info. It's so weird. It always sounds so cheesy to me, but time and time again, whether it's a Redline info stealer takedown from human security researchers, or the humans being arrested for snowflake data breaches, or the people affected during an incident, cybersecurity is not about tech or ones and zeros. It's about people. So if that is people, plural, not singular, it's a collective collaboration across law enforcement, security researchers, ethical hackers, public and private sector, everybody. It's gotta be innovation and ingenuity and resilience, not just from attackers, but from us defenders too. And look, I don't know what that means for 2025 or 2026, right? Or 2030 or whatever. I don't know what steps to take in what direction, but it's gotta be some steps forward in any direction. It's action over inaction, because if we don't, the adversaries will. Thank you so much for watching.